All units be advised, do not detain or engage with Jonathan Carter. I repeat, stand down immediately. The dispatcher's voice burst through Officer Blake's radio like a thunderclap, slicing through the tense night air. The words struck him with a force he wasn't prepared for. His grip on Jonathan Carter's arm slackened for a split second, his heartbeat hammering in his chest. Jonathan, still pinned against the hood of his own car, turned his head slightly. There was no panic in his eyes, no fear. Just a quiet, unsettling confidence that sent a cold shiver down Blake's spine. The murmuring crowd sensed the shift. Even the teenager recording with his phone zoomed in, capturing every twitch in the officer's stiffening posture. Jonathan's voice was barely above a whisper, yet it carried the weight of a thunderstorm. I warned you. Blake's jaw clenched, but for the first time tonight he had no words. But just moments earlier, he had been in complete control. Or so he thought. Flashing red and blue lights illuminated the quiet street as Blake aggressively swerved his squad car behind the black luxury sedan. He had been waiting for a moment like this all night, a reason to flex his authority, to remind someone who was really in charge. The moment the car stopped, he was already on the move, his heavy boots pounding against the pavement. The driver's tinted window slid down smoothly, revealing a sharply dressed black man behind the wheel. He was calm, composed, and that alone irritated Blake. He rapped his knuckles against the window with deliberate force. License and registration. The man didn't flinch. Instead, he gave a slow, measured nod and reached into the glove compartment. Of course, officer. Blake's lips curled into a smirk. He had seen this before, the arrogance, the self-importance. The ones who thought a nice suit could protect them. He leaned down, eyes narrowing. You in a hurry, buddy? The man handed over his license without a word, his gaze steady. Blake snatched it, scanning the name. Jonathan Carter. Didn't ring a bell. Step out of the car. Jonathan didn't move. Is there a reason, officer? Blake's smirk widened. Because I said so. A beat of silence. Then Jonathan shook his head slightly. You don't want to do this. Blake let out a dry chuckle. Oh, I think I do. He grabbed the handle and yanked the door open. Before Jonathan could say another word, Blake gripped his arm and pulled him out, shoving him against the hood of the car. The sound of impact echoed through the street. Gasps rippled through the small crowd forming on the sidewalk. A teenage boy lifted his phone, already recording. You fit the description of a suspect driving a stolen vehicle, Blake sneered, pressing down harder. And I'd say resisting arrest doesn't look too good either. Jonathan inhaled deeply, his patience thinning. This is my car. Blake scoffed. Oh yeah, and I'm the Queen of England. He pulled out his radio. Backup requested. I got a hostile suspect. Jonathan closed his eyes for a brief moment. Then he exhaled slowly, shaking his head. I warned you. Blake rolled his eyes. Yeah. Save it. Then his radio crackled. All units be advised. Do not detain or engage with Jonathan Carter. I repeat, stand down immediately. Silence. Blake's stomach twisted into a knot. His fingers twitched against Jonathan's arm. The crowd leaned in, sensing something big was happening. Jonathan finally looked at him, his lips curving into the smallest of smirks. Now, Officer Blake, he said, voice smooth as steel. Would you like to let go of me, or do you want to make the biggest mistake of your life? Blake's mouth went dry. Who the hell was this guy? His grip on Jonathan's arm tightened for just a second, out of instinct, out of pride, but the weight of the dispatcher's warning was pressing down on him like a vice. The crowd was watching. The teenager's phone was still recording. He could feel his authority slipping through his fingers, but he wasn't ready to let go just yet. Stand down, Blake muttered under his breath. His jaw clenched. No way in hell. He forced Jonathan's arm behind his back, snapping one cuff around his wrist. I don't take orders from some faceless voice on a radio, he growled. Jonathan let out a soft chuckle. That, he said, his voice dangerously calm, was your second mistake. Before Blake could process his words, the screech of tires filled the air. A second squad car came to a halt, and another officer, Sergeant Miller, jumped out. His face was a mask of panic as he rushed toward them. Blake, let him go. Now. Blake barely spared him a glance. Back off, Miller. I got this handled. No, Miller snapped, voice urgent. You don't. Take those cuffs off right now. Do you even know who he is? Blake scoffed. Yeah, he's some smug rich guy who thinks he's above the law. Jonathan sighed, shaking his head. Third mistake. Miller paled. Oh God. The murmuring crowd grew louder. People were piecing together that something wasn't right. The teenager holding the phone was grinning now, sensing the tides turning. Jonathan shifted slightly, eyes locked on Blake. "You're making this worse for yourself." Blake wasn't listening. His mind was racing. Why was Miller so scared? Why did the dispatcher give that order? And why, despite everything, did Jonathan Carter look so damn composed? His hand hovered over his radio. Maybe he should check in. Maybe he should confirm what was happening. But before he could move, a new voice cut through the night like a blade. "Officer Blake." The tone was sharp, authoritative. Blake turned and saw a sleek black SUV pull up beside the squad cars. The door swung open, and out stepped a man in a dark suit, his expression unreadable. Jonathan smirked. "Well," he murmured, "it's about time." The suited man approached with measured steps, his eyes cold as they locked onto Blake. "You just put your hands on the worst possible person, Officer Blake." Blake's pulse roared in his ears. He straightened his back, trying to reclaim control. "And who the hell is he?" The man didn't blink. "He's your new boss." Blake felt like the ground had been ripped from beneath his feet. Jonathan Carter straightened his cuffs, a slow smile forming. "Not just his boss," he corrected. "The highest-ranking officer in this entire state." Blake's hands felt numb. His mouth opened, but no words came out. The world around him blurred. The crowd's gasps, Miller's shaking head, the flashing lights. It was all drowning beneath the deafening realization crashing over him. Jonathan Carter was the new police commissioner, and he had just assaulted him in front of dozens of witnesses. The teenager with the phone whistled low. "Oh man," he laughed. "You're done for." Blake's breathing turned shallow. This wasn't happening. This had to be a mistake. His entire career, his entire life, was hanging by a thread. Jonathan took a step closer, voice barely above a whisper. "Now," he said, "what should we do about you?" Blake flinched. Jonathan took another step forward, his presence commanding, suffocating. Blake had spent years intimidating people, lording his badge over them. But now, standing before the man he had just humiliated, he felt like a mouse cornered by a lion. Miller was sweating. The suited man remained stone-faced, hands clasped behind his back like he was waiting for a death sentence to be carried out. The crowd was silent, their collective breath held in anticipation. Blake's throat felt dry. Look," he stammered, scrambling for control. "I didn't know who you were. This is just a misunderstanding." Jonathan's smirk deepened, but there was no humor in it. "A misunderstanding," he echoed. "Tell me, Officer Blake, would you have treated me any differently if I were just another black man driving a nice car?" Blake's jaw tensed, but he had no answer. They both knew the truth. Jonathan turned to Miller. "Uncuff me." Miller fumbled with the key, his hands trembling as he freed Jonathan's wrists. Jonathan rubbed his wrist for a brief moment before straightening his cuffs, his movements deliberate, unshaken. Blake exhaled in relief. Maybe, just maybe, he could still get out of this. Then Jonathan turned to the suited man. "Call internal affairs." Blake's stomach plummeted. "Wait." Jonathan held up a hand, silencing him. "No, you wait." His voice was smooth, but it carried an undeniable weight of authority. "I've spent my entire career dealing with officers like you. Men who abuse their power, who think a badge makes them untouchable." Blake shook his head frantically. "Come on, I made a mistake. I didn't know." Jonathan's gaze hardened. "And how many times have you done this to someone who wasn't in my position? Someone who didn't have a camera recording or a badge that outranked yours?" Blake opened his mouth, but nothing came out. The suited man pulled out his phone and made the call. Blake could feel the walls closing in, his future slipping through his fingers. The crowd was murmuring now, the realization sinking in. They weren't just watching an officer get in trouble. They were witnessing justice unfold in real time. Jonathan took a slow step closer. "There's something poetic about this moment, Officer Blake," he said. "You're about to learn what true justice looks like." Miller swallowed hard and took a step back. The suited man nodded to Jonathan, confirming the call had been made. Jonathan's eyes never left Blake's. "Hand over your badge." Blake's blood ran cold. "What?" Jonathan extended his hand. "Your badge." Blake's fingers twitched toward his chest, but he hesitated. "You can't." "I can," Jonathan interrupted, his voice like steel. "And I just did." Blake clenched his fists. He wanted to resist, to argue, but the truth was glaring. If he didn't comply now, it would only get worse. His hands trembled as he unpinned his badge and placed it in Jonathan's open palm. The weight of it leaving his fingers felt like the final nail in his coffin. Jonathan studied the badge for a moment, then looked back up at Blake. Now turn around. Blake's entire body locked up. What? Jonathan handed the badge to Miller, who looked at it like it was a ticking time bomb. Then he turned back to Blake. You're under arrest. Blake staggered back. This is insane. You can't arrest me. Jonathan arched a brow. You assaulted a superior officer. You unlawfully detained me. And let's not forget the abuse of power. He tilted his head slightly. Tell me, Officer Blake, how would you handle this if the roles were reversed? Blake's breathing turned shallow. No. Jonathan nodded to Miller. Cuff him. Miller hesitated for only a second before stepping forward and pulling out a fresh pair of cuffs. Blake's struggles were useless. Within seconds, his own hands were bound behind his back, just as he had done to Jonathan minutes earlier. The crowd erupted into cheers and laughter. The teenager recording zoomed in, capturing every moment. Oh, this is going viral, he laughed. This is the best day ever. Blake thrashed in the cuffs. You can't do this. I have rights. Jonathan gave him a cold, measured look. Now you care about rights? Blake's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. The realization that he had no escape was finally sinking in. His authority, his power, his entire career, gone in the blink of an eye. Jonathan stepped closer, lowering his voice so only Blake could hear. This. He gestured to the cuffs. This is just the beginning. Blake's stomach twisted. What does that mean? Jonathan's smile was slow, calculated. You'll find out soon enough. The flashing red and blue lights reflected in Blake's wide, panicked eyes as another squad car pulled up. This time, the officers stepping out weren't his allies. Internal Affairs had arrived, and they weren't wasting time. Officer Blake, a stern-looking woman in a dark suit announced as she approached. You are hereby relieved of duty, effective immediately. Blake thrashed against the cuffs. You can't do this. This isn't right. Jonathan watched him with an almost eerie calmness. Funny. I remember saying the same thing when you threw me against my own car. The crowd's laughter rippled through the night air. The teenager recording leaned in closer. Yo, this is better than reality TV. The Internal Affairs officer gestured toward the patrol car. Put him in. Miller and another officer took Blake by the arms, marching him toward the back seat. Every step felt like a walk toward his own funeral. People had their phones out, filming every humiliating second. The same spectacle he had created for Jonathan was now his own nightmare. As Miller opened the car door, Blake tried one last time. Jonathan, Commissioner Carter. Please. You know this isn't fair. Jonathan slowly walked toward him, hands in his pockets, the power dynamic completely reversed. He leaned in just slightly. Justice isn't about what feels fair to you, Blake. It's about accountability. Blake shook his head violently. Please, I have a family. Jonathan's expression didn't waver. So do the men you've harassed. The families you've torn apart. How many times have you used that badge as a weapon instead of a shield? Blake's breathing was shallow. His future was slipping through his fingers like sand, and there was nothing he could do. Jonathan straightened. Get him out of my sight. Miller shoved Blake into the car, slamming the door behind him. The once feared officer was now just another man behind the glass, stripped of his power, his control, and soon his freedom. The crowd erupted into cheers. The teenager spun his phone toward his own face, beaming. This is history, y'all. Drop a like if you love to see justice served. Jonathan turned to face the people gathered around. His face, though calm, carried an unmistakable weight. He stepped onto the curb, letting his voice carry over the noise. What happened here tonight is exactly why we fight, he said. The crowd quieted, listening. This isn't just about me. This is about every person who's been humiliated, disrespected, or abused by someone who thought their badge made them untouchable. A few people clapped. More joined in. Soon, it was a full round of applause. Jonathan nodded. Change starts with accountability. And tonight, we held it in our hands. The teenager waved his phone. This is going to be viral in an hour, man. Jonathan gave him a small smile. Good. Let the world see it. As the police car carrying Blake pulled away, the crowd watched it disappear into the night. Justice had been served. And for once, it had been served swiftly and without mercy. Jonathan turned, stepping into his own vehicle. As he gripped the wheel, his reflection stared back at him in the rearview mirror. This was only the beginning. There were more Blakes out there, and as commissioner, he was going to make sure they were held accountable. Every last one of them. The teenager's video was already trending, the comments rolling in like waves. This is the best thing I've ever seen. Instant karma. Jonathan Carter is a legend. This is why you treat people with respect. You never know who you're messing with. The title of the video? White Cop Humiliates Black Man. Regrets it when he learns who he really is. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more powerful stories like this, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Turn on notifications so you never miss an episode of Justice Served.